Turn up your mind.
I don't believe you ought to interfere in the market. If there's to be a minimum wage, my theory is if Oklahomans want a minimum wage, we ought to have it. I don't believe there ought to be a national minimum wage. That's my position. I'm the only member of the Republican Party that's still here that voted no on the last one. And I believe that markets work better than bureaucrats. And I think there's lots of downsides, and there's lots of written in the economics field on raising the minimum wage, whether you raise it $1 or $20.
Yeah. How about raising it $20? That would be good. That way people can actually afford to live. Welcome back. It's hour 2 of the Thursday edition of the Randi Rhodes Show. Randy will be back Monday. I'm Nicole Sandler of RadioOrNot.com. And, yeah, you know, that's one of those millionaire Republican senators who yesterday decided that, you know, working people just don't deserve a raise. Yeah, he is one of the 42 Republican senators who voted against opening debate on raising the minimum wage. Isn't that what senators are supposed to do? Debate important issues and then vote on them? Well, this was a vote on the procedural motion to begin debate. And 42, every one of them Republicans, except for Harry Reid, who had to vote that way so he can actually bring the vote back again in a procedural manner. Every Republican in the U.S. Senate, with the exception of Bob Corker of Tennessee, voted against allowing debate on raising the minimum wage. By the way, an issue that around 71% of Americans are in favor of. Way to go, Republicans. Again, it all goes back to that thing. They just don't care if you're poor or black or brown or, you know, hurting. Hey, you're just lazy. You know, their whole roundabout way of thinking, you know, I try to follow their reasoning, and it just, God, it doesn't make sense. But if I can sort of try to piece it together, you know, and I've heard it from all of them, from Paul Ryan to, you know, every one of them. Oh, it keeps you down. You know, if you're getting government subsidies, well, you know, you're not going to be, you know, you're not going to be incentivized to find work. You're just going to sit back and live the high life on, you know, food stamps and unemployment. I mean, seriously? This is how they think. It's insane. It's because they're so far removed from reality, right? So, yeah, yesterday they did that. The senators voted against opening debate on raising the minimum wage. And it's interesting because today happens to be May 1st. It's May Day. May Day, International Workers' Day. And, you know, it's celebrated around the world. This is how our Republican senators are honoring working people, saying, you know, you can work for pittance. And there's Tom Coburn saying, I don't think we should have a national federal wage. Let the free market determine it. You know, the free market. Yesterday we talked about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And if that thing were to go through, and thankfully it's looking less and less likely with each passing day, but, you know, stranger things have happened. If that were to go through, and we're now in this sort of weird, otherworldly trade agreement with nations like Vietnam, where I think the going rate for labor is something like 25 cents an hour, can you imagine if we didn't have a federal minimum wage here? What... You know, it would leave it up to the market. Hey, you need a job. I need workers. Now I could ship these jobs overseas to Vietnam and pay $25 an hour, or, you know, I'll pay you $4. You want the job or not? Because I'll find someone else to do it. That's what they want. You know, I would like these people to have to live the life of somebody who works full time for minimum wage. I think it comes out to somewhere around $15,000, somewhere in that neighborhood. And, you know, it's below the poverty level. And that's why when Walmart and McDonald's and those other behemoth corporations pay their workers a non-living wage, they pay them minimum wage, it costs the taxpayers money. You get that, right? Because we have to subsidize their low salaries, their low wages, because their employees have to go on public assistance. And in fact, McDonald's, I think it was McDonald's, had a hotline set up for their employees to help them, help them access the food stamp program. Help them get help from the government. That means help from you and me. For all this talk, this anti-government mentality, we're the government. That's something they've lost. These people who wave the Constitution around like a prop, who've never opened it and read the thing, don't they know the basic? It's government of, by, and for the people. That's how this democracy was set up. They badmouth the government, yet they want to work in it, right? They're happy. Paul Ryan's happy to take his $174,000 a year salary. But he, and then in the next breath, he'll talk about how bad the government is. They'll honor Grover Norquist, who says we need to shrink government so small we can drown it in a bathtub. If you hate government so much, then don't work in it. Someone else would gladly take the job, who would do a better job. And for that matter, and we'll get into this a little later, for those people out there in Nevada who are taking up arms against federal officers, who don't recognize the authority of the federal government, how about we take back some of the vernacular? Love it or leave it. I choose to love it and try to make it hold to the ideals upon which it was founded. Now, I've actually read the Constitution, unlike these idiots who wave it around, like a piece of jewelry. In the first hour, I played a little bit of this clip from Paul Ryan, right? I want to back it up and play it from the beginning again. This is him in March, and again, this comment caused a little bit of controversy because people like us called him out on it.
This tailspin or spiral that we're looking at in our communities, your buddy Charles Murray or Bob Putnam over at Harvard, those guys have written books on this, which is we have got this tailspin of culture in our inner cities in particular, of men not working and just generations of men not even thinking about working or learning the value and the culture of work. And so there's a real culture problem here that has to be dealt with. Everybody's got to get involved. So this is what we talk about when we talk about civil society.
But boy, his impression of inner city residents, of minorities, is so warped. And it might be because, he's a big Ayn Rand kind of person. And in that cut, he was quoting Charles Murray. Charles Murray, who's best known for his books, his social science books, that say that blacks are inferior biologically and intellectually. They're inferior to us white people. This is who he's quoting, right? And then he goes on to say this.
Everybody's got to get involved. So this is what we talk about when we talk about civil society. If you're driving from the suburb, to the sports arena downtown by these blighted neighborhoods, you can't just say, I'm paying my taxes, government's going to fix that. You need to get involved. You need to get involved yourself, whether through a good mentor program or some religious charity, whatever it is, to make a difference. And that's how we help resuscitate our culture.
Really? So that's it. That's the answer. Rely on charities who are hard-pressed enough as it is. Rely on churches who take in money from their parishioners, right, and try to help, their members. They're supposed to fix blighted neighborhoods rather than rely on the government. I'll tell you what, Paul Ryan, how about raising taxes on the millionaires and billionaires who your new budget wants to give them yet more tax cuts? How about making them pay a little bit more so that we can help fix those blighted communities? How about letting the wealthiest among us contribute a little bit more to help the rest of us who are hurting right now? Oh, no. No, you should just rely on churches and charities for that. Really? We've seen this play before. We've seen this movie before. And it didn't work well. The last time I was here for Randi, a few weeks ago, we interviewed the Princeton professor who was one of the authors of this new study that says, this America has become an oligarchic society, although he said they didn't use that word, but everybody, every analysis of the study, the headline read, we are in an oligarchy. And the average person doesn't even bother weighing in with their elected officials because they think their voice doesn't matter. they think their opinion doesn't count anymore. Well, one of the greatest economic minds, I believe, Paul Krugman, was interviewed by another great journalistic mind, Bill Moyers, about just this situation.
You said we live in such an ugliness in America right now.
Yeah. This is one of the things that puzzles me, actually, about my own country, which is it's one thing to have disparities of income and wealth and to have differing views about what we should be doing about it. But there is a level of harshness in our debate, mostly coming from the people who are actually doing very well. So, we've had a parade of billionaires whining about the incredible injustice that people are actually criticizing them.
They hurt
and
my
then
feelings.
Comparing anyone who criticizes them to the Nazis. It's almost a tick that they have. This is very strange, and it's kind of scary because it's one thing if someone without a lot of power seems to be going off and into a rage for no good reason, but these are people who have a lot of influence because of the amount of money they control.
Yep.
Given what you've just said, and given the fact that there's this ugliness, what do you think it's going to take? A mass uprising? Consistent demonstrations? Insurgent politics? How are we going to stem the tide that he says is taking us into oligarchy?
There's a negative and there's a positive take. Piketty seems to argue for much of the book that we only escaped from the old oligarchy for a while, thanks to really disastrous events, thanks to wars and depressions, which disrupted the system. That's an argument you can make. On the other hand, if you read histories of the New Deal, you know that it didn't spring out of nowhere, that we had a progressive movement and a lot of proto-New Deal programs building for quite a long time. There was, in fact, a move in America. There was an increasing political, philosophical readiness to take on inequality of wealth and power long before FDR moved into the White House. And so I think there are better angels of our nature, that there is this ugliness which can be frightening, but there is also a redemptive streak in here and in other places, and that you don't give up hope on this, that given consistent argumentation, given events, and perhaps, as people become more aware of what is actually going on, then there is a chance of changing things. Do we know that? No, but there's nothing in what we know now that says that you should give up hope of being able to change this even without catastrophe.
Oh, even without catastrophe. So there's Paul Krugman saying it was a progressive movement that changed things before. And the progressive movement was taking hold even before FDR got into the White House. This movement to take on wealth and power. You know what they say, history repeats itself. That progressive movement is here. We're here. We're sort of like the silent majority. We have no access to the biggest megaphones in the country, right? They're taking that away from us. But boy, we're here, and it's bubbling under. And it's rising up today, May Day, in a big way in Seattle. When we return from the break, I will tell you what happened today in Seattle, where traditionally on May Day, workers march. They do this every year. It's an annual May Day protest in downtown Seattle. They march for immigrant and worker rights, including the campaign for a $15 an hour minimum wage. All right, on the other side, I'll tell you what they did in Seattle. Bernie Sanders coming up, too, and your calls at 866-87-RANDY, 866-877-2634. Nicole Sandler in for Randi Rhodes. We'll be right back. All right, so it's Nicole Sandler in for Randi Rhodes, and in the city of Seattle today, they announced a deal to increase the minimum wage to $15 an hour by the end of the decade. How interesting is it that this comes the day after the U.S. Senate, the Republicans in the U.S. Senate filibustered the cloture motion, the vote to open debate on the subject. Right, pretty sickening, and I got to give props to Senator, where is he? Bob Corker of Tennessee, who was the only Republican who voted with the Democrats to begin debate on the bill. And his quote to when asked about it from Talking Points memo, he said, "While I think the underlying policy is problematic, I think we should always debate ways to help improve the standard of living of Americans." Right. The rest, every single one of the other Republicans in the U.S. Senate said, nope, we're not even going to talk about it. I'm just going to hold my nose and hold my breath until my face turns blue, because I don't think those damn poor people have a right to a living wage. All right, the second part I just threw in there. But really, I mean, that's what happened here. So this is cool. Let's see. The increase in Seattle will phase in at different speeds for businesses of various sizes. Employers with more than 500 employees would have 3 years to adjust their pay scales, while smaller companies would have 5. Tipped workers would become subject to the $15 per hour minimum after 5 years, and that's huge because right now, if you go to a restaurant, for instance, like here in Florida, the wait staff, they're paid such substandard wages. It's like $3 an hour or something.
I believe it's $2.13. Hasn't changed since 1991.
Disgusting. So when you think, wow, I got to tip, the bill is so expensive, is it you need to tip because they get paid $2.13 an hour. Oh my God. Well, you know who we really can credit in Seattle for this? Shama Sawant. Does that name sound familiar? She is a new city councilwoman in Seattle, and she is a socialist. Yes, Sawant forced a runoff with 35% of the primary vote and went on to defeat her opponent in a close contest in November. And listen to, she's the real deal. I'm looking at an interview that our friend Joshua Holland did with Councilwoman Sawant at BillMoyers.com. Sean, I'll send it to you. You can put it in the homework section. And he writes, Sawant walks the walk. She kept her campaign promise to take home only $40,000 out of her $117,000 salary, saying in a release that a hefty paycheck, quote, removes council members from the realities of life for working people. Every council member faces a choice of who they represent and which world they inhabit. My place is with working people and their struggles. And so Josh asked her, well, what do you do with the rest of the salary? And she said, technically I'm paid $117,000 by the city. I'm taking home $40,000 and I'm giving the rest to social justice movements. I've created a solidarity fund, but I want to make it clear that it's not charity. The point is that if we are to have a political system that's accountable to the interests of the majority, then how are we going to do it with public officials and executives being paid salaries that are completely out of the realm of the average worker? Really good point. She's amazing. This woman is a rising star. She is a socialist, a self-identified socialist. Interesting that Senator Bernie Sanders just moments ago finished speaking on the floor of the Senate. It was, I guess, open speech time. And he was talking about wealth inequality in this country. Well, guess what? Bernie Sanders, although he is labeled an independent, by the media always, is actually a democratic socialist. That's one of the things I'm going to ask him about when he joins us after the break. Really, socialism has been given, become a dirty word, just like liberalism was, and just like they're trying to make progressive into a dirty word. I say we take it back. I say we could use a little more socialist attitudes in this country and take care of one another. Nicole for Randy, Senator Sanders next.
Rhodes.
I don't believe there ought to be a national minimum wage.
That was Oklahoma Senator Tom Coburn yesterday after the Senate Republicans voted to filibuster the cloture motion to begin debate on a bill to raise the minimum wage. They said, nope, we're not even going to discuss it. And there you have Senator Coburn saying, no, I don't think we should have a national minimum wage. Boy, what a horrible policy that would be. I'm Nicole Sandler in for Randi Rhodes, and I'm thrilled to welcome our next guest to the show, Senator Bernie Sanders from Vermont. Actually just finished speaking on the Senate floor a few minutes ago. Senator Sanders, I got to hear the last couple of minutes during a commercial break, thanks to C-SPAN streaming, and it's always a pleasure to hear you speaking because I agree with pretty much everything you say.
Well, thank you very much, Nicole, and nice to be with you.
Always nice to talk with you. This issue of income inequality is one of the I think most pressing issues of our day. We look at the data, and it shows that the rich in this country, the top 1%, if you will, their income has just risen exponentially over the last decade, while the middle class has just remained stagnant, has remained flat. And in fact, a news story broke just the other day that the U.S. middle class used to be the strongest in the world, and now we've been surpassed by Canada and other nations. Our middle class it's a dying breed, it seems.
It is, and this is the great tragedy of modern America. Median family income has gone down by $5,000 since 1999. You have millions of Americans today all over this country who are working longer hours for lower wages despite huge increases in technology and productivity. And as you've indicated, the great middle class of the United States now lags behind Canada and I suspect several Scandinavian countries as well.
You know, Senator Sanders, I adopted my daughter as a single woman in the year 2000. I was doing well. You know, I was a radio professional living in Los Angeles, had a good job, a great salary. The American dream, it used to be that we always would strive to give our children a better life than our parents were able to give us. And it was always possible, it seemed, generation after generation. And I had no reason to think that the life I could give my daughter would be any different. I would be able to give her a great life and things would be well. And boy, since that time, since 2000, it just seems to have gone from bad to worse to almost disastrous, to tell you the truth.
Well, Nicole, I mean, what the facts are is that, and I have 4 kids, we have that generation, the younger generation today has the dubious distinction of being the first generation of the modern history of America to likely have a lower standard of living than their parents. So what's happening now in America is we have more people living in poverty than ever before. We have the highest rate of childhood poverty of any major country on earth. We have a middle class that's disappearing, but at the same time, the people on top are doing phenomenally well. And according to recent studies, 95%, listen to this, 95% of all new income generated in America goes to the top, you guess.
I'd say top 1/2 of 1%.
It's top 1%.
Okay, well, there you go.
95% of all new income goes to the top 1%, which means that the vast majority of the people are losing ground. You know, prices of gas at the pump are going up.
Unbelievably.
Food is going up.
Everything.
You know, costs are going up, and yet people's wages are remaining stagnant or in some cases going down. Now, getting back to Senator Coburn's position on the minimum wage, what you have here is yesterday we had a vote.
Right.
And the vote was to raise the national minimum wage from $7.25 to $10.10 an hour. Actually, the vote was to allow us to
talk about it. Right. Exactly.
We got one Republican to allow us to go forward to debate the issue. And today you had on national radio Senator Coburn saying essentially he does not believe in a federal minimum wage. Now, the truth is that Coburn is not the only Republican to have that position. There are many Republicans. And what they believe, and this is a very important point, what this right-wing extremism that they espouse is about is basically withdrawing the government from protecting the needs of the middle class and working families in almost every area that you can think of. So in terms of the minimum wage, most of us think, and most Americans think, $7.25 is a starvation wage. We've got to raise it to at least $10.10 an hour. That's what the American people think. What these guys are saying is, no minimum wage. Let's end the concept of the minimum wage. And if in a high unemployment area, an employer says, well, I'm prepared to hire you, and I'm going to pay you $4 an hour. And you say $4 an hour, that's a starvation wage. And when he says, well, I got 10 other people who
take it or leave it.
Take the job. That's freedom. Do you understand the point? These guys believe in quote-unquote freedom.
Yeah.
And that is not having the government interfere to make sure that you at least earn a minimal wage. And so the same thing in terms of job safety. You could be working in a plant where people are losing their fingers or their arms, and you don't want the government to interfere to make sure that people work in a reasonably safe environment. That's terrible. And then we should abolish the EPA because that is restricting the freedom of companies, Nicole, to pollute our air and our water and our soil. But that's just a terrible, oppressive government. You want to get rid of that as well. That is what, not to mention Social Security, Medicare.
Right. You know, they want you to have the freedom to starve to death or to freeze to death or to be homeless or to live on the streets.
Exactly. That is their definition of freedom. And, in fact, what has happened in this country over the last 80 years, since the 1930s, is the whole story of the the United States of America has been the effort to ensure rights for working people, rights, so that when you get old, you know what, before Social Security, half of the elderly people in America lived in poverty.
Yes.
Today, while the number is too high because of Social Security, it's somewhere around 9%. Before Medicare, what happens if you were old and sick? What happened to you? Well, you had nothing.
Right.
And today you have Medicare. And if you were poor, you had nothing. Today you have Medicaid, et cetera, et cetera. And these guys are hell-bent. That is their vision. And people don't know it. This is what the Koch brothers and these guys are about. It's not just repealing the minimum wage. Ultimately, they want to get rid of Social Security and public health programs and a variety of other programs to protect the kids and the elderly and the sick.
And I always wonder this, though, Senator Sanders, to what end? I mean, where did they see this taking us other than into another Great Depression with millions of homeless people waiting on bread lines, living in tent cities?
I don't think that they think that high. I think what happens, and I'm not a psychiatrist
right.
to be able to analyze as a member of Congress
right.
Looks at this thing, but I think what happens is if I say to you, guess what, Nicole? I am prepared to give you $50 million for your campaign. And this is what I believe. I believe we should get rid of Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Suddenly, the ideas that I tell you attached to that large check for your campaign become quite appealing, right? And you begin to believe that stuff.
Yeah, right.
I think psychologically that's how it works. So they believe it, and they say this is what America is about. We don't want that big bag government protecting the elderly, the children, and the sick and the poor. But just coincidentally, I'm going to take a check from the corporate people or the Koch brothers, and who happen to also believe that.
Yeah, and then you know where their loyalties lie. And that's why we need campaign finance reform. I'm proud to say the one and only time that I was in the Senate gallery, you were speaking and you introduced your constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United. And I'll tell it took everything in me not to scream out, yeah, when you were done. But
well, I'm glad you didn't.
I know, because I would have been arrested, right? But it was so great. I mean, it was so great. And I would like the American people to wise up. I mean, look, the polls are like 70% is a conservative number. 70% of the American public believes it's time to raise the minimum wage. And yet, boy, those 41, I guess, Republican senators said, no, we're not even going to talk about it. No debate. How?
This is how they get away with it. Because they know that in the next election, in 2014, November 2014, the expectation is that 60% of the American people are not going to vote.
Right.
And of the 60%, probably 70, 80% of low-income people are not going to vote. So if you're sitting there and the American people say, raise the minimum wage, strengthen Social Security, protect Medicare and Medicaid, but you know that a lot of the people who are impacted are not going to vote, you don't have to worry about that.
Right.
What you worry about are the guys who contribute heavily to your campaign. And that's the cynical nature of what goes on here.
Oh, it's horrible. We have the 2014 midterms coming up, obviously, in November, and then on to 2016. We've talked about this before. Bernie Sanders, you've said that a couple of times, you have been honest, you said that if no one else steps up who's going to put out a progressive campaign who's going to talk about progressive ideas and ideals and priorities, then I'll do it. Will you? I mean, obviously, if Hillary's the only declared candidate, you'd step up and do it?
Well, it is you quoted me accurately. That's what I have said. I mean, it's not that I wake up every morning thinking I have to be president of the United States. I think anyone who thinks that is a little bit crazy, given the problems facing this country. But I do believe that when a middle class is disappearing, when we have the whole challenge and crisis of climate change, when we are the only nation in the industrialized world that doesn't guarantee people health care through a national health care program, when, as we've discussed, the gap between the very, very rich and everybody else is growing wider, when we don't have any campaign finance for home, when we have all of these issues out there, we need candidates to stand up for the middle class and working families of this country. I believe that very strongly.
Yes.
We can't have a campaign when the major issues are not being discussed. And I'll tell you, I get around the country a little bit, Nicole. I was in South Carolina and North Carolina and Minnesota last weekend. And you would be surprised at how much support there is out there for a strong progressive agenda that represents the needs.
I'm not surprised. I know there is. I think we are kind of like the bubbling majority. We're here. We're just waiting to pop up, but we're here.
That's right. That is exactly right.
Yep.
So I think, and the other thing that we need to do, and I hope people who are listening to the show understand that, if the turnout in this election in 2014 is low, the Republicans will control
everything.
The United States Senate and the United States House.
Yep.
If the turnout is high, they will not. Simple as all that.
Yep.
And people do not have the luxury anymore of saying, oh, my God, everything is terrible, everything is awful, I'm not going to vote, I'm not going to participate. Sorry.
Right. No.
We don't have that luxury anymore.
Do not.
We got to do the best that we can. We got to support the best candidates that we possibly can. Even if they're not perfect, we got to mobilize our friends and our neighbors to get out and vote. 40% voter turnout is a national disgrace, so we've got to do a lot better than that. And the Republicans are hoping and praying.
Right. And they're
doing everything that they can, by the way, to make sure the turnout is as low as possible.
Right. Well, of course. That's why the restrictions on the voter IDs. Exactly. That's why, everything they're doing, because, look, we like to win honestly, right? They'll lie, cheat, and steal. They don't care. They'll win ugly as long as they win. They'll do whatever it takes.
Gerrymandering.
Yep.
They win by making it harder for people to vote. So our job is to bring people out. Look, this is a great country with a great history. I do not think that the majority of our people want to become an oligarchy.
No, we're already there.
Our economy and politics are run by a handful of billionaires. That's the challenge that we face, and we've got to stand together and move forward.
Let me ask you one last question, because, you are always referred to as the independent senator from Vermont, because you're not a Democrat. You caucus with the Democrats, and they call you the independent, but actually you are a Democratic socialist, yes?
Yes.
And I was just sharing with the listeners the story of city councilwoman from Seattle, Shama Sawant, who helped usher through today. They announced a deal with labor and business in Seattle to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. And she is a socialist. Socialism is not a dirty word, is it?
Well, I think if people understand history, what they will understand, not only history, but understand what goes on around the world. Throughout Scandinavia and in Europe, you have had democratic socialist governments, social democratic governments, which have passed legislation over the years, which have provided health care to all people as a right, which provide free college education, which make it possible when you have a baby to have 6 months off with full pay or half pay, it depends on the country, which make sure that moms have great child care available for their kids, which have strong retirement benefits, essentially which have governments working for ordinary people.
Yeah.
And they have voter turnouts, by the way, that are much, much higher than we do. And they have free speech, so it's not, restricting of freedom of speech. But they have governments that work for ordinary people. Most Americans don't know that.
No, they don't know that. And because they believe, because they hear right-wing talk radio, equate that socialist, fascist, Nazi Muslim, describing President Obama, who was none of the above. But, if they would do a little reading once in a while, read some history books, read Howard Zinn, learn something about history, learn something about the world, they might realize, actually there are some socialist countries who take care of their people. And
also to understand, just in one example, in the area of health care, there is one major country on earth, that does not guarantee health care to all people as a right.
That would be us.
That is the United States of America. So, I just don't know how many folks know that, but that is a simple reality, and we've got to do better.
Well, again, if they didn't keep cutting funds for public education, people might learn those things. It's one of those. Well, Senator Sanders, I do hope you run. And as I said the last time we spoke, I hope you run as a Democrat, because we need your voice on that big stage, the debate stage, so that you can help pull all the other Democrats to the left and make them understand what being a progressive means. So I would love to see it. I hope it happens. Bernie for president. I'm there.
Okay. Nicole, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Senator Bernie Sanders. He is a gem. He is a gem. Sanders, Warren, Sanders. then I would be really happy. All right. 866-87-RANDY is the number. Nicole Sandler for Randi Rhodes. We'll be right back.
Here's my idea. Let's get radical. Why don't we run Jesus himself for president? I mean, why not? What American that you know wouldn't want to vote for Jesus Christ of Nazareth? A guy who was a peaceful, radical, nonviolent revolutionary who hung around with lepers, hookers, and crooks, who never spoke English, was not an American citizen, who was anti-wealth, drove the capitalists out of the temple, anti-death penalty, anti-public prayer. Yes, he was Matthew 6:5, but never once anti-gay, never mentioned abortion, never really condemned premarital sex, never called the poor lazy, never justified torture, never asked a leper for a copay, never fought for tax cuts for the wealthiest Nazarenes, and was a long-haired, brown-skinned, it's in Revelation, sorry, Kirk Cameron, community organizing, homeless, Middle Eastern Jew.
Oh, he left out socialist in that one. John Fugel sang there. Nicole Sandler in for Randi Rhodes. Yes, Jesus was a socialist. All right, let's go to the phones. Victor in San Francisco, listening on AM 910. Hi.
Hey.
Hey.
How's it going?
Good.
Yeah, I'm a big, huge Randi fan.
Me
I've been
too.
listening to her program for at least 10 years. And nobody motivates somebody by listening to her program. She articulates the Republican threats, their whatever you want to call it, their strategies better than anyone, and she really exposes them. And I think that's the biggest thing that they are threatened by is people knowing what they're trying to do. I mean, they're all out in the open now.
Oh, yeah. Well, information is power, and they do not want you to have information.
It's completely power, and I feel terrible that we're losing our general.
Me too.
I mean, Randi, I wish you would stay until November and finish this beautiful 30-year career. You know, on top, maybe we can win this thing.
I think, well, look, I wish she could stay too. And I think, you know, we don't know what's going on behind the scenes, but we can win. Just people have to vote. And that means you and I, if it means volunteering with the local Democratic club so that we can go and give people rides to the polls. We need to make sure people vote. Look, Democrats traditionally do not vote in midterms. I'm coming up against the clock, so I'm sorry, but thank you for the call, and I agree about Randi. She's a voice that we need. We need to get her voice back.
The Randi Rhodes Show.